Welcome, everyone, to another episode of The Men's Room. Today, we're joined by Linda, the transformational re-engineer of life, and myself, the bearded wordsmith. Today, we're going to be discussing the topics of communication and how vital it is when it comes to work life and personal life, whether that be relationships, family, or other sorts. So, just one thing before we get started, don't forget to hit subscribe and like the video as it helps further the engagement and gets it to more people to see. So now we'll get started into the topic, and I'll sort of lead it off from the perspective of work and how vital it is to get communication correct in the workplace. And this is something that I've had experienced personally when it comes to talking to people. And a lot of people have struggled to be able to communicate effectively in the workplace or break down issues when it comes to arguments or opinions. And a lot of times that comes from either personal bias or being emotional in the time and place, which is not what you want. You want to be able to have open discussions as well as eliminate the need for emotions. And that's because when you're emotional, whether you be angry or happy, you tend to be more inclined to one side of a conversation opposed to being neutral and exploring all aspects of it. Sometimes when you're angry, you'll be closed off to having lines of communication that might help you because you're getting criticism about how you work or something you might be doing wrong. And that's where the best way to address it sometimes is acknowledging what they're saying and setting some time away to reflect on the conversation which is had before you fully give your opinion, because sometimes your opinion might come out the wrong way and rub someone the wrong way, and that's not what you want when it comes to workplace relationships. You want to have a safe, inviting, yet intellectual conversation that people can come back to at any point in time. You don't want to be talk the wrong way and have them walk away feeling that you don't like them or something is wrong with them. And that's the worst part. Is a lot of people that I've talked to when it comes to workplace communications struggle with this sort of thing. When it comes to conversations about how to improve workplace performance or other things like that, they struggle to understand that certain things need to be met. And it's not because of the way they are. It's just they need to be meeting their certain KPIs in order to be able to achieve what the business is looking for. And sometimes it is hard to tell it in a tactful way that doesn't hurt their feelings, because sometimes it might be their speed of the work they're providing is too slow, or the quality of work is deteriorating over time. And it also comes back to the boss. When the boss has these types of communications, or you're the person talking to the person below you, you've got to take a second to reflect that there might be personal things happening with them. There might be something at the home life that might be affecting their work life. And sitting down with them before you discuss the reason why they're slowing down in work or the quality's getting worse might be best point of option, because you don't want to make their life worse by not having time to understand the things that are happening in their personal life. And that's why sitting down and being a friend first and then a co-worker can really benefit them, because you're establishing that relationship with them. You're having an uh, open line of communication where you're not closed off to hearing their opinion, hearing how they are, and you're being a genuine human. Because the moment you just treat them as a transaction, or you put a number on them and you just tell them to do this, this, and this, there's a disconnect. They don't often feel as if they're in a team, as they're a part of something. And that's when you have breakdowns in communication, in workplace relationships, and various other things. I'll hand this over to you, Linda, and see if you've got any thoughts on what I've just talked about.
Yes, Michael, I have a lot of thoughts on the different things that you have addressed. And so you talked about in the workplace that there could be something going on in a person's life that we should be open to exploring and not assuming that a person is choosing to act in a certain way or not act in a certain way, whether that's the way they're communicating or their performance. You talked about how it's important to make it a safe place, because you've got to open up the channels of dialogue, because if someone doesn't feel safe, they're not going to communicate. They're going to withhold from you. And, one of the challenges in the workplace is that emotions get in the place of effective communication, because when we are operating, or the other person's operating under this adrenaline rush, let's say, or some kind of fear or some kind of upset, then what tends to happen is we get defensive in our communication. We might say things without actually pausing to reflect and think about them. We might make decisions that we wouldn't normally make if we were grounded in our thought. And so all of these things can happen in the workplace, and I've seen all of them, but I've also been on the other side of it, where I haven't been the most effective communicator because I've gotten emotional. I've been defensive. I may have not felt like it was safe to speak. There might have been some assumptions being made about what the person's true intentions were. And so you take all of those things, and quickly there's a communication breakdown. And you and I have spoken before, a communication breakdown can exist because of two things. It's either that a person becomes misunderstood, or they decide to withhold their communication because they don't feel like they're either safe to do it, or that their word would actually move the needle and somebody would take an action. So those are the reasons why breakdowns occur. And, you know, one of the best things a person can do when they are faced either with a difficult conversation or something that they need to be influential, is taking the time to ground oneself, to come clear headed to the conversation. And there are times where taking that pause and taking that 5 minutes to step away and then come back, it's so much better, because then you can stay in that neutral place. So when there's difficult things, that's the hardest thing to do, is to not let the emotions take over. And that's both positive and negative emotions. Either one could happen. And it's about listening to understand, listening to, and having that empathy, and really starting to walk in the other person's shoes. I will find that even in the times where there's an assumption, and these things that we spoke of can happen, the grounding, the listening to understand, then all of a sudden there's some light shed on what the other person's intentions or understanding is, that becomes known. And then when it becomes known, then a lot of these assumptions or emotions fall to the side, because now there's this clear understanding, because there's some directness in what needs to happen or not happen. And then the magical thing happens. There's cooperation. There's mutual cooperation, because the two parties have come to an understanding on what it is that they both want. And when each party can understand what they both want and be open to discussing how they can get there, it changes the whole dynamic of the conversation for the good.
That's something I definitely agree upon, and that's where touching on a point you just talked about is remaining neutral. And one thing that people must sort of do when it comes to effective communications in the workplace or any place in general is using logic and reason, using the facts in which they've been presented and how they've been presented. Because once you start asking why in which someone is talking to you the way in which they are, do you finally understand that there might be something that you're doing wrong, that they're communicating ineffectively, they might be coming across as a bit arrogant or egotistical or narcissistic, and it's hard to tell them in that present point in time. And it's not until you're able to come back to them when they've cooled off a bit, so to speak, whether that be a bit of an argument or something that's happened. And this goes back to even personal and family life. When you have sibling rivalries, it can be a very divisive time, and it can be very hard for you to think clearly, and this is something I've experienced personally growing up with a lot of brothers, and there'd be times when you're often very heated that one another will golf at each other, and that's because there's different roles within the family, and it goes to even workplaces. Like there's different roles that each person has, and it's understanding that even though that someone is above you doesn't mean that their opinion is not just as valued as the person that's at the very bottom. Like when you've got someone that's the youngest versus the oldest, their opinions are just the same because they're experiencing life. They're still going through the motions, even though they have different opinions or different points of view, doesn't make them invalid in what they're saying. The only times it does is when their truths or facts that they're using are invalid and what they've learned is incorrect. And that can be a hard conversation to have with someone, is when there's a lack of education or lack of understanding around certain topics that they speak upon, and it makes it hard for them to be told tactfully that they're saying the wrong things or doing the wrong things. Even in the workplace, a boss might come to you saying that your spreadsheets haven't been effectively put together, or you might have this, and this disconnect, but he might not specialize in spreadsheets or doing data analytics and these sort of things. So it's hard for him to fully speak on it and be accurate, because with everything that you've been trained that it is the right thing, that you've done everything correctly. But from his point of view, you might be wrong. And that's where you have to sort of address it and be like, well, I'm trained in this, and this field, and this is what I specialize in. At the end of the day, I know I'm correct, even though you might think I'm wrong. And that's due to the fact of your boss or whoever you're speaking with has a lack of understanding, has a lack of knowledge of what is actually required with these spreadsheets, because his point of view and his perspective has come from the wrong sort of understanding or knowledge or lack of knowledge. And that's where just sitting down and having an open line of communication and showing them what is actually required with these sort of projects or these types of events can actually help elevate the workplace, help improve the general moods and stuff, because no one's thinking that you're doing anything wrong. And same as with family life. You might have a younger brother come to you, or a younger sibling, saying that you're doing this, and this, and you're wrong because of it, but they don't understand that there's certain reasons why in which you do something. And that's taking the time to educate them. But that's where family and work life can be very different at the same time, because with family, they're always around you. They're around you 24/7, and they often compare you to your past actions and choices. So they have you with a long rap sheet, so to speak, and they'll sit there and pick that apart and say, well, you used to do this, and this, and then why all of a sudden have you changed, or why all of a sudden are you thinking this way? And it's because they don't understand that you're changing, you're improving yourself. Just because you had an opinion on something before doesn't mean that opinion was valid at that time. And it's hard to communicate with them that you were wrong or they were wrong. And it's difficult because they get their egos out of place, they get emotions involved, they want to be better than the other person, and there's rivalries. And that's where it's a very difficult thing to try and effectively communicate with them that you're both right, except sometimes one or both parties might be wrong at that present point. It's just because of lack of understanding or lack of knowledge. And not until you sit back and reflect on these decisions, as you were talking about, instead of going at it in the heat of the moment and saying something you regret forever, taking the time that is needed to give an indirect answer and saying, I appreciate your input, I appreciate your opinion, but I'll come back to you with a definitive answer in an hour, 3 hours, or the next day. So you're able to take time to cool off, reflect, and think about the answer in which you're going to provide. So you're not going to hurt their feelings, whether that be your boss or your brother or your sister or anyone. Because as soon as you get involved one-on-one and you start speaking your mind in the heat of the moment, you tend to do the wrong thing. Not always, but a lot of times, and this is speaking from personal experience, that you get a little too heated or you get a bit too argumentative, and you don't realize until it's too late that things have been said, and once they've been said, you can't take those words back. So it definitely helps to take that time to reflect on the actions that you're going to take, or the words in which are going to be said, for at least an hour or more. So that way you're not got emotion involved, or able to have time to cool off, go for a walk, have a drink of water, do something to distract yourself, and then come back to the situation with a new pair of eyes and a new way of thinking about it. I'll hand this back over to you, Linda, and see if you've got any thoughts on this.
Yes, I actually have quite a few thoughts about some of the things that you've been sharing here. And so, really, when I'm looking at effective communication, it always begins with getting curious about what is being said or not said. And you make a good point about sticking to the facts and not making assumptions. And, we don't want to invalidate anybody's expression. And really, we're not looking to win, I guess is one thing. Sometimes when we're having a discussion, we're looking to have that upper hand. We want to be right. We don't want to be proven wrong. And so when we start doing that, then that starts to actually erode the conversation and having that safe place where you feel free to express an opinion or a thought or how something maybe like in the workplace should be done, based on like your experience or your knowledge. And the moment when we don't invite the other person to also share their perspective, we lose. Because it always should be a two-way street. And you're right, when things get heated or emotions run high, the best thing that we can do is to acknowledge that there's a conversation going on and that something different may need to happen or not happen, and be uh, um, willing to readdress the person, like to ask for time to step away and to come back into the conversation when it can be had. Because you are so right, when we get in the heat of the moment, whether it's in the workplace or with our family member, no one is going to make good decisions about anything when they're not listening to understand. They want to have the upper hand. It just really is not serving anyone, because at the end of the day, whether you're in the workplace or you're in the home, two people should be able to have different opinions or perspectives and be allowed to have them. And you don't have to adopt that person's view or perspective. And each person can have their own and still come out ahead. Um, the thing that I wanted to emphasize in our conversation today is that effective communication isn't something that you mastery and it's a one and done. It's a lifelong exercise to continue to build how we communicate. Because, under stress, this is, for example, an area that a person that's normally a really effective communicator, they may not be when they're under stress. And so they may have to learn, when I'm under stress, I don't communicate directly what I need. And so I need to focus on figuring out how I can have a conversation when I'm in that place. And it isn't always easy. And we see people that are maybe leaders, and we're like, well, that person should get it right. They should know better. They should be able to go and take that conversation and be able to remain in that neutral place and have mutual conversation, understanding that good is going to be coming out of the conversation. But that isn't always what happens. And really taking a step back when those things happen and realizing we're all human, and that we're all, at the end of the day, I think we all want the best for one another, but we don't always act like it. And so just acknowledging the fact that we aren't perfect and that we're always working on our communication, and we can always be better at it. And the more you practice a skill, the better you get at it. And so, I tell people, if you're having a hardship, or maybe you're not as comfortable with a conversation that you need to have with someone, well, then sit down and write your talking points down. When you're not in the moment, think about what you'd like to have happen, and you are so much more equipped to go into that conversation when you have those talking points. You've given that time to reflect, to really see, what do I want to have happen? And, asking the other person, can you meet me there? If when you can do that, all of a sudden the conversations, no matter how difficult, become really easy, but we don't always feel like it in the moment. And so it's those moments where we are in our heightened emotions that if we practice when we're not in that place, then when that happens and we're aware, because having awareness is key, you can go into the conversation in a much better place and feel like that both parties are going to get what they want because they both desire to have that said thing. And I tell people all the time, just tell the other party what it is that you would like to have happen, and then there aren't any assumptions. Not saying that actually is a breakdown, because then they're assuming things about you as well. It's so interesting to be in a conversation that's going not so well, and then all of a sudden, when everyone finds their grounding and gets curious and asks really good questions and they say what they want, it all of a sudden changes.
That's something I definitely touch upon too with I guess my own personal experiences. Using emotion when it comes to communications can be a dicey situation, but at the same time, it's learning sometimes when you're anxious or you're shy or you're worried that those are the best times in which to ask that question or talk about an opinion that is divisive, or just push your limits, because that's how I've become such an effective communicator in so many different aspects of my life, is not being willing to conform myself to one emotion. Like, I'm always anxious or stressed in certain situations when it comes to speaking because I'm pushing my comfort zone. I'm pushing what I'm able to do. And that's where most people too, I feel, get comfortable with a certain way of speaking, or they get comfortable with not asking those questions because they're afraid of treading on toes. They're afraid of annoying the big boss or annoying workers or family members. And that's learning that sometimes those questions that you leave not to be asked are the ones that need to be asked a long time ago. So, and that's the thing that I sort of learned the hard way is you don't know what you don't know. And if you don't ask that question, then you'll never know the answer. You'll be sitting there pondering it forever, and you'll try and come up with your own assumptions, and then you'll make an ass of yourself. And that's the last thing anyone wants, is to assume something, then be proven wrong because the assumption in which they've made is wrong entirely because they don't have the information required to make an accurate decision. And that's where, by asking and just having open dialogue with people and understanding that you're not always going to be happy, or you're not always going to be open to these types of communication, types of communications that you're going to have with these people, but knowing that those types of communications can really help you grow as a person. And it also helps just develop your skills when it comes to one-on-one communication or group speaking or something like this, where you're having to present in front of people, like 5 or 10 people, and you get anxious or shy, or you get social anxiety. And it's perfectly understandable to feel that way because we are humans and not every two people are the same. Not every two people are going to have that confidence that they exude and be able to just step into that area and just start speaking straight away. Other people take time to develop that skill and develop the know-how and how the talking points are presented, or how to pronunciate the words and communicate effectively. Because sometimes you can walk into a workplace and communicate extremely well with one person, but then sit in front of 5, 10, or 15 people and then have a breakdown in communications because you're anxious and that anxiety is washing over you. And then it's hard for you to get a clear head to put the communication in place that is needed to effectively communicate those points. And it's just understanding that, embrace that feeling, push those limits, because as soon as you limit yourself to not wanting to do that potential opportunity, you limit what you can do. You stay comfortable. And that's one thing I say to everyone, is be comfortable in those uncomfortable situations, because you never know the person in which you can become. And when it's asking for that promotion, asking to be respected in the workplace, asking to be just listened to by coworkers, it's something that's really important. And most people, I feel, lack the understanding of what can come from those conversations. They think, or they assume, that it's going to be a negative thing, and sometimes it can be a negative opinion or a negative conversation, but at least you've had the conversation. At least you've actually gained information behind what you're curious about. And ask that question, because not all questions will be answered happily and joyfully. Some questions will end up having a really hard or bad answer that you weren't looking for, but at least you've received the answer. And that's where it could be definitely an interesting thing to try and push yourself when it comes to communications in the workplace or family. And one thing I was going to ask you, Linda, is what's one thing that you've seen a lot of when it comes to workplace communications that people struggle with, and what would be one of the ways in which they can get over that problem or the issue they're facing?
Okay, well, when you were speaking, you were talking about the F word, fear. So I would say in the workplace, there's a lot of fear about speaking up, about for what it is they might need help with, something that they need to express an opinion on so a decision can be made. Um, and so you talked about, people don't want to step on somebody's toes. They want to ask for something in a professional way where they're well received. They want to speak to maybe a coworker about an issue or a problem that needs to get addressed. All of these things happen, and I would say the number one thing that I do in any workplace I'm a part of is I'm usually that emotional support system when someone needs to have a difficult or hard or scary conversation. We sit down, and what usually happens is there's this fear of what they don't want to have happen. So they're telling themselves, I don't want my supervisor not to take me serious. I don't want my coworker to be mad at me. Um, or I don't want to come across as not knowledgeable. So they're in their head, they already have a limiting belief of all these things that they don't want to have happen, when really the fear that they're thinking is going to happen when they address this person or persons, half the time they come back to me. Well, actually, probably more than half the time they come back to me and I said, well, how did that go? And they said, oh, I can't believe I was fearful. I can't believe I worried about that. The conversation was great. And I got what I wanted to achieve, which was to be understood. I got that next assignment. I got my issue resolved. All of these things happened. And you had mentioned it earlier that because they had the conversation and they faced the fear, they gained information. They have the facts to make an informed decision about that thing that they were wanting to address. And so this fear that they had was way worse than the actual conversation was ever going to be. And what I share with people is equip yourself to go into the conversation prepared. And I would say the number one thing, and I've said it a couple of times this evening, is to say what you want to have or you don't want to have happen in this conversation. Because when you have a conversation and you're facing something and you need an answer or a solution or a resolution, any of these things, then that's what you lead with when you go into the room before you even have a conversation. And if you need to talk to someone about something that you find hard or difficult for you, state it. It's really difficult for you and I to have this conversation because I don't want to disrespect your authority. That sounds good, right? Or it could be, I want to have this conversation with you, and what I don't want is for there to be a lack of cooperation. I don't want to have this uh, situation where we can't work together. I want to work together effectively. And when you say these things in a similar fashion, then it's really hard for the other person not to want to meet with you and go down that road together, because people get defensive, worried, upset when they don't know what your intentions are. So you're stating your intention when you start, and what will happen by the time the meeting's over, then it becomes altogether easy.
One of the questions that I was thinking about asking you, and this could be for our listeners that have kids and stuff, is
Mhm.
what's one of the biggest things that you've encountered with communicating effectively when raising kids? What's one of the issues that you found that often comes up, whether it be being misunderstood or misheard, or just having the things come out the wrong way due to being emotional at the time? And what was one of the ways in which you've fixed it, or you're learning to fix it?
That's a good one. So with kids, wow, well, it can be really easy to become frustrated when you've asked your kids to do something and they haven't done it. So to have kids be accountable, we have to be kind of like in that workplace mode. We have to assume that they weren't not doing something to to cause a problem or to mm, to be disagreeable, any of these things. So we need to have that same compassion for them and find out why maybe they didn't do something. So I asked you to clean your room. Can you share with me what prevented you from doing that? We talked about having it done by this evening and it still looks like a disaster zone. And so then it's like the child could say, well, I was working on my homework. It took me longer than I thought. I thought I had more time. Now I realize the time has gotten away and I didn't clean my room. It could have been that simple. It couldn't have, maybe it's not because they were lazy, it's because something took longer than expected and they didn't anticipate the time they would actually take to do it because they waited until last minute.
Got another quick question. Having both types of kids, being female and male, have you found that asking the same question can be misunderstood depending on the person? So if you ask your daughter the one question and then use the same question on your sons, can it be interpreted completely wrong between both parties?
Oh, absolutely. They're both motivated differently. And so, even a question around why they did or did not do something. Yes, I will actually, one question of reasoning, when I ask it, I will ask in two different ways for that reason.
Just wasn't too sure of it. I'm sort of curious. And what would be the best method in which to communicate with your kids effectively to make them feel included, but also make it feel like you're not trying to boss them around too much or try and step on their toes because you want them to have independent thinking and not trying to enforce your own opinions, because
Mm,
that's something that I see a lot of parents doing nowadays, is trying to make their kids a mini version of themselves, and they end up going the complete opposite route. And I know you're quite the opposite to that. You like to include them with everything, but also let them make their own decisions. And what would be one of the ways in which you could um, help educate the listeners with kids on how to do this so they have a stronger relationship?
mm. Yes. So, I mean, first off, uh, our children are individuals too, and we would like them to be mini us, I guess. I think there's something to be said for we like it when our children exhibit some of our characteristics and traits, the good ones, and maybe, to have their own. And as I'm thinking about this, I've always given like options to make decisions. I don't assume that because they are kids that their opinion or their desires are any less than mine. And so I don't talk down to them. And I'm not trying to conform them into becoming a mini version of me. Um and I've done that with their career exploration. When they had an interest in a field, I said, "Hey, let's go check it out. Let's go see what it would take for education, training, skill set, and we go do that." The same for when they've wanted to pick their sports. I didn't pick their sports and tell them that they're going to play said sport and that they had to stay in it for the life of the sport. Um, there were times where there were changes. Actually, they chose to maybe not continue to play a certain sport or to participate, and so they gave me their reasons. I listened, and then ultimately that was their decision. And so, yeah, not forcing our opinions and not making it feel like they don't have a decision. Because the moment kids feel like you're forcing something and they don't have a say, and then it becomes, you don't understand me, you're not listening to me, how can you tell me how it is, you're not living my life. And so I've always felt like each person has to live their own life, and then the day that I'm not here, they need to be able to live their own life. And if I do everything for them or tell them how it needs to get done, well, then that doesn't seem like a very good way to go about the life that they're living, if they're only doing things to, and to impress me, like doing it because I think it's a good idea. And then resentment starts to come in if you do that. So I really believe in um letting them be their own people, letting them make mistakes. That's another one. A lot of times parents want to swoop in and save them every time that they make a mistake. Well, sometimes they need to make the mistake to learn from it, because if there isn't somebody there telling them not to do something, then they don't learn to live on their own. And so that could be a particular thing that's really important for parents to learn.
So that's something I definitely agree upon. And even coming from the perspective of being the eldest in the family, it's learning when to step back, because not always is your advice needed or warranted. And it even goes to parenting, because you might give your kids some advice and they completely ignore it because they're like, oh, mum's just doing this, this, and this. And they don't understand that you're just trying to help shortcut that lesson. But sometimes the best ways in which to do something is to let them learn that hard lesson. And there's no other way, because it is difficult when you're your own person. You think you know everything, but that's far from the truth. None of us know everything. And it's especially hard when you're a parent who's trying to figure out the right ways in which to deal with something. And kids often push us to our limits. And I'm only speaking from experience of speaking to fellow parents. Personally, I don't have any kids as of yet, but I know from the perspectives in which I've had with other parents that it can be an interesting time teaching kids how to just enjoy life and educating them, giving them the option to be able to pursue those things that make them curious, or let them ask the question why, because only when they ask the question why will they find the answers that they seek. Because if you constantly try and feed them something that they don't want, then they're going to revolt and never want that thing ever again. But if you teach them about the thing that they don't want and then leave them to their own devices to let them have an educated opinion by learning about it in a different format or learning about it in a different time, they're not going to resent that option or that point of view. And that's one of the things that I've sort of found. And to touch upon a different subject is communication when it comes to uh, let's see, relationships with people, not so much with family members, but communicating with friends. And what would be one of the biggest, I know I'm asking you a lot of questions, so if you have any questions for me, spin it back my way, but what would be one of the biggest ways in which you've found to communicate effectively with friends about when it comes to workplace time or family time, and how you reserve time for them, and how you would um, go about asking not asking, but talking about those sort of points, because I've personally found that very hard to distinguish the time that is needed for personally them, for work, and for family, because sometimes I'll exclude work life because the relationships that I have with my friends, and then I find my work life deteriorating because of that. And it's learning to balance it and be tactful with the conversations you have. So that's what I was sort of going back to, is what's one of the best ways you've been able to manage those communications with your friends to establish that relationship?
Yeah, so to me, the best way to answer that question is it all begins with communicating boundaries. And so really, if you're needing to focus on your work and your friends want to go do something, for example, um, and they want to do it during your work hours, well, obviously that's not going to work too well. And so, making time for them, you communicate that, and you figure out, with the work where you can fit in, and you try not to overcommit or say yes to things when let's say your work needs you. So you let them know, I'm on assignment, I have a tight deadline, and so I won't be able to go to dinner on Thursday night like we normally do every week. And so I'm going to need a couple weeks of us not doing that, but when I'm done with my assignment, get back on schedule, we'll resume our normal Thursday night dinners, for example. And I'm just using that one just because there's so many different work schedules these days because of remote working. And so uh I found that to be one that I've had to share is to just be open about what is going on and be honest about it and not dance around the issue and uh, not address it. Because I think if you tell a person I am busy working on an assignment because my job has this expectation, that's one thing. Um, and so I think that that's really what needs to have happen. And most people, when you share or communicate what you need, they're going to be able to do it. And I guess the other thing is too, if you have a hard time like saying no because you have commitments, tell your friend to or that they, you could use their help, and just kind of maybe um withhold from asking like me to do said things knowing that I have this thing because my friendships and relationships are important to me, and so I might maybe I have the tendency to go do those instead of what I'm supposed to be doing because I'm just taking the contra example. Whereas you set a boundary, they honor it, but then there's times where maybe you need them to hold back a little bit so that you can focus on things. And I think that's okay. It's when you don't communicate it and you don't say anything, then the person's left wondering where they stand with you because you haven't told them anything. You just kind of go off and do your balancing of your work and you haven't communicated anything to them. And so they don't know why you uh haven't been part of the program.
That's definitely true. Is I think one of the key takeaways there is just being direct
Yes.
and sort of not being afraid to tell them what is needed or required, because you would like to do the things that you want with them, but not always do you have the option to do that. Sometimes you have family commitments that come up or workplace commitments, and not always are you able to spend time with your friends like you would like. And that's one thing I've encountered over the years is the my friend circle has gotten smaller only due to the activities in which they partake are not what I want. And it's communicating to them effectively saying that this is no longer the person in which I am. I'm still more than happy to remain friends with you, but unfortunately, I don't want to do this or go to the pub anymore and have a drink per se, because that's what we really like to enjoy and stuff. And it's telling your friends that that part of you is no longer there, but you're still able to have communication with them, talk to them, treat them like real people. You just don't want to participate in those activities because they're not helping further your career. They're not helping further you as a person. And sometimes people are quite the opposite. They'd rather sit there and go to the pub and drink all day and have those good times. And it's each to their own. So it is definitely a hard topic to have with certain people and friends that certain workplace commitments are better suited instead of doing personal friends relationships, because the workplace commitments actually help push that needle forward, help further you as a person and make you a better person. Where sitting there doing nothing at the pub and drinking won't really achieve things. There are times for leisure and there's time for work. And I'm a bit of a believer that I like to work more than play, so to speak. So at least when I go play, I'm prospecting or I'm doing something like that, or I'm walking up the side of a mountain. So I guess my activities are a bit different to most people. And that's where the other thing that I was going to ask, and it might be a bit of a harder one, but what's a funny sort of what's one way that you've encountered when it comes to your dating life back when you were younger? What was something that a lot of guys struggled with, whether it be asking you out on a date or different things like that? What was something that's you knew that they could have done better, but at the time you didn't know how to communicate it right?
Oh, that's a good one there. I was thinking about some of the other things you're saying. So this one's gonna put me on the hot seat here for a moment. Okay, so something that a person could do better on asking someone on a date. Hmm.
Something that you've encountered from being a
Mm-hmm.
young woman in your days, and a lot of
Mm-hmm.
guys asking you out and stuff, and or something about even being more direct and being more open,
Yeah, yeah.
because
Well,
guys, I
okay.
think
Okay,
often
because I
find
can
ourselves shy and stuff.
yeah, I can think of one. So when you're going to ask somebody out and you're going to go do something, then be real clear on what it is you'd like to do. So that way there isn't this like, well, we should go out to dinner. Well, where should we go out to dinner? So make a decision, make a suggestion, pick a place that you think that the person would like to go to, and then ask if they would like to do that. Because I think that is really important, is when you're establishing that relationship and you're learning to find out what their preferences are and what they'd like to do. Well, the best way you're going to find out is to either ask what they'd like to do or just give a suggestion. I would like to go to the said restaurant. How does that sound? Or would you like to do something that we stay in and go, and have time to talk? Figure out what the person wants to do and then offer it as a suggestion rather than leaving it open-ended and not really deciding. And so making plans last minute doesn't always work. And so you might not end up getting to do anything of any value because you haven't made the reservation, for example.
That's definitely one thing I think is true. And from the perspective of me, it's or being a male in a relationship, it's definitely hard to assume what the female wants because there's often a breakdown in communications. They expect the male to know everything and to be able to just think on the spot. Oh, she'll want to go to this place, or she wants me to do this, this, and this, and that's not always the case. It's communicating effectively of what you want out of the other partner, and that's where it can be hard in the beginning if you're not used to being like that, because some males are really clued on. They can pick up on those little hints, and other males need a big broad sign put in front of them for them to understand. And it's definitely an interesting topic because I've encountered both sides of the spectrum. I've been with women that's really easy to pick up on the hints, and other women that are just extremely hard to pick up on those hints and signs that they're sort of giving me. And it's sitting down and saying, well, if you're going to take me out to dinner, I'd like to go this, and this place, or the things that I like to partake in are going up on hikes here or going to the bowling alley or something, because a guy will often go with his best intuition or his best choice on the other half of the person and not always get that correct. It's hard to fully understand what the other person is thinking or what they want out of you. And that's where it can be very interesting when you go to like the pub, for example, instead of going somewhere like the arcade or something just to make some memories and have a bit of fun. Like, not always will they want your choice, and it's understanding that you both have to compromise to make something special, make something that's meaningful. And they might, like, you might want to go to the pub and they might want to go to the arcade. So instead of doing that, you go to a fine restaurant or some place where you can go for a walk, play some mini golf, still do a bit of both, like have some fun playing around while also having a bit of a dinner or something, and change it up a bit. Or even going for a hike where there's a restaurant at the top of the mountain or something, and thinking about these experiences differently. Because I've experienced it too often that I get in trouble for assuming what the female wants. And it annoys me, but I also understand that we do the same thing. It's not just one side of the conversation. We often assume, or we often get the female to assume what we want as well. So when it comes to even birthday gifts or things like that, we're like dropping hints casually along as the weeks lead up, and then all of a sudden we get a product or something completely different. Like, for guys, you hint that you want a new tool set or you want this for the car or this, and this, and then she ends up getting you pajamas, which is still very nice and thoughtful, but it's not quite what you want. And it's sitting down and not being direct, I guess, with presents and gifts, but being clear with communications when it comes to relationships and being open to having these discussions, having times at least once a week where you can sit down with your other half and discuss how their week's been going in depth. Are there any things that they're unhappy with? What things would they like to be changed? And having open conversations, because as long as you have those type of discussions, then you'll be able to have a long-lasting relationship that will go through the decades. Whereas if you just assume and you constantly try to bicker, fight, and bullshit all the time, and it's hard for you to have a loving relationship that is meaningful, and you'll end up splitting up. So any thoughts on this, Linda?
Yeah, well, yeah, I had lots of thoughts. And so you're right, setting aside time to have the conversation, figuring out what the person's love language is would definitely be it, because whether it's words of affirmation, quality time, um, what kind of things they like to do. I mean, if you're not asking those questions, then everyone's assuming, and then nobody gets what they want. And so, to keep it interesting and engaging, we got to talk to one another. We got to ask, open-ended questions where we actually get at the answers. And so, is you mentioned before that some people might be shy, or they might be know what they want, and they'll say what they want, but then they don't ask the other person what they would want. They just assume, or they just go ahead and charge through and go do it, and then they find out the hard way that, oh, maybe I should have asked what they wanted to do, or asked what their life goal is. And because when you get curious and ask these questions, you can learn a lot about a person if you're willing to open up and the question, and then really listen. You'll find out quite a bit, and that's what keeps it interesting. Yeah, I hear all the time people will say, well, they should just know what I like. They should know what I want to do. They should understand me. And it's like, well, if you're not talking to what it is that you want, need, and desire in your relationship, well, then that's on you a little bit, because you are not communicating. And if you're a person that's not asking, well, then you're also not communicating, because it's supposed to be this mutually satisfying thing. It isn't about even the man leading and the woman receiving, or vice versa, because I think a lot of times too, people look at the roles and they think, well, the man should always lead, the man should always decide. I kind of went there a little bit when we were talking about that. But you can choose to take turns for sure, and you don't have to stay in that particular gender role necessarily. It's the two people involved, but make a decision to have a conversation. Don't just like let your relationship happen to you, because if you do that, you're gonna miss something. You're on mute.
Yeah, definitely. It's being flexible in those situations and understanding that it's not always is the one person going to do the designated roles that are required. The other person might occasionally do them on time to time just to help out, because they either have time around the house, they just want to try something different. And that's where you just have open dialogue with them and tell them that I'm more than happy for you to help me with X, Y, and Z, as long as you know this is how it's meant to be done, like this, and this. Because if it's all good and well if the person wants to help, but there's nothing worse than when that person helps and then puts that activity 3 steps behind. Like I use the example of mowing the lawn. Like there's nothing worse than someone going out mowing the lawn when one other person does it all the time, and they mow it on either too high of a height or too low of a height, and it just destroys the lawn or doesn't really cut it. And that's something where it can be a breakdown in communications, because it is one thing to ask about if they could do it, but if the other person doesn't tell you how exactly they want it done or how it needs to be done, then it's hard for you to do the thing correctly. That even goes back to workplaces and stuff like that. You can ask your boss, do you want this task done? They could say yes, but if they don't give you the required information, or if you're not willing to ask for that required information, there can be a breakdown in communication right there. And that can prevent you from completing that project or completing that task that is required. And that goes back to anything in life. You ask your friend if they want to come down for beers, but they don't tell you the exact type of beer or how long you're going to be drinking or even where you're going to be drinking. There's a breakdown of communications. You're going to assume things, and more often than not, you're going to get something wrong. And that's where it's never being afraid to ask those questions, whether it be personal relationships with family members, your other half of your partner, work relationships, or so many different things. Because most people will tend to ask one question, but not ask the follow questions, because they don't want to be perceived as being annoying, or they don't want to pester the person. But the only way you get to know is by asking, because you don't know what you don't know. And it's as simple as that. Like, you don't know if you don't ask as well, which is the other saying of that.
Yes, and then what can happen too is if you're not asking and getting information, you might become resentful. And so that's no good. And so really, communication is always going to work for you. It's when you don't do it that it'll actually erode your relationships. Um, And I can't think of a time where communication eroded your relationship. It's lack of it that will do that. And so that's really what we wanted to leave our audience with today, is the fact that whether it's personal or business relationships where you're communicating, the rules are exactly the same. The rules are exactly the same. The sensitivities might be different, but the rules are the same. And I just want to encourage people that if you're having trouble wanting to communicate, then that's your cue that, oh, I have an opportunity, I can improve. And if you don't know how to go about the communication that you need to have, that conversation that you want to have but you're afraid to, sit down with someone that you trust and role play the conversation. Write down your talking points, play it out, and chances are you can have that conversation that seems scary with someone that's safe. Then when you have to go do it in real time with the real players, you've already practiced and prepared. And so then you're a little more confident about going in and having it. And the luxury to doing that, you might feel a little weird talking about a personal conversation you want to have with an individual, but I'd rather do that and then have the feedback given to me in the conversation that's not the real one. So I have time to adjust my messaging to be able to go in a better way, because sometimes we might go in with using words or messaging that wouldn't really be self-serving, and someone trusted could say, when you say it this way, it's not helping your cause. Or when you say it this way, you sound a little defensive. Maybe we could like think of a different way to say that. And so that's really the advice that I wanted our listeners to hear, is that communication doesn't have to be difficult, and it's only absence of communication that really causes a problem. And half the things that we're afraid of don't ever happen anyway. They're not even real in most of the cases. They're assumptions that we've made. And the best way to put that to bed is to practice our communication, and then it becomes easier.
That's definitely one of the key takeaways. And I was going to touch upon your very last point there is, for anyone listening who's struggling with communication or learning how to push your limits, it's sometimes you're best off talking to a lot of people. Like for me, I struggled with communication when I was younger. I struggled with communications when I was going through primary school, high school, even in my early days of adulthood. And it wasn't until I got a job in high school in a supermarket that was pretty big, and I worked across a massive town, I improved with my communications, because I was speaking with hundreds of people each week. I wasn't just speaking with one or two people. And it goes back to a previous episode where I said I was addicted to gaming. With being addicted to gaming, it was very detrimental to the way in which I was, but it had a lot of benefits too. It allowed me to speak with thousands and thousands of people, probably tens of thousands of people over the years, and understand how people are, how people communicate, the cues in which they use, how to pronunciate certain words, and how to speak to a certain person based on the answers in which they provide you, because not always will you be able to speak to the same person and then think that's going to work for another 3 or 4 people. Each person is unique in the way in which you speak to them. And that's one of the things that you could do, is just going and pushing your limits, going to get a job at a very public place, and trying to slowly open yourself up to communicating. Because that's one thing that kids struggle with nowadays, is how to communicate effectively when it comes to being in the family with their friends. They think that they should do this, this, and this because all the other kids do it. And that's quite the opposite. If you want to be an intellectual, you can't sit there and assume things. You've got to be willing to push your limits and go outside of your comfort zone. Because that's what I'd done when I was a kid. I went outside of my comfort zone, pushed my limits, because I used to be a recluse. I loved sitting around with myself, doing nothing, playing games. And it wasn't until I got a job in a massive supermarket chain and then became the manager within only a few months because of the expertise that I displayed. And that's where I pushed my limits. I wasn't willing to let my own comforts define me, because I knew I could do better. I knew I could be more. And that's where I understood that. I recognized the faults in which I had as a person, and I was addressing them slowly, because you're not going to be able to become an amazing communicator overnight either. That's the other thing of it. You're going to sometimes take weeks, months, years to be able to communicate in certain ways effectively and talk about subjects that you otherwise wouldn't have been able to talk about before because you've gained insight and opinions to be able to communicate effectively in the workplace, relationships, or family. So, anything else you'd like to add before we close this episode up, Linda?
Just that I'm glad that you and I had the opportunity to really take in this topic and to share just what you had mentioned, that becoming an effective communicator takes time. We're always improving upon it. And some topics we are more suited or find easier than others. And so, you know, there's going to be times when you're going to still practice the skill set of how to effectively communicate. And one of them could be influencing decisions.
Hmm. That's definitely a big thing. So, but I'll probably end it up here because we'll speak about upon communications in the next few episodes that we have. So I hope everyone listening enjoyed the conversations in which we had. You can find Linda on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, and X, formerly Twitter. And likewise for me, you can find me on X, formerly Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And if you have any questions or if you even want to become a speaker on the show, put it down in the comments below or send us a direct message on one of our social media pages. The links to those will be in the description. So I hope you all have an amazing day and we'll come back to you with another episode in the future.
Thank you. We'll be seeing you in the future episodes of the Men's Room, where we help individuals to be able to step into their personal place of power.